stories from the Global South. If I could now invite the speakers and the moderator on stage, Stephanie Depavin, Senior Research Fellow at ODI in the UK, Anhag Singh, Founding Member and Vice President, Platforms, Policy and Operations at Mount Tech Growth in India, Jainaiba Sove, Public Relations Officer from the Open Gambia Network in Gambia, Alison Gilwald, Executive Director, Research, ICT Africa, and the moderator Mansi Kedia, Senior Fellow, Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. If I could invite the speakers and the moderator on stage. This panel will be discussing what can be done during South Africa's presidency of the G20 to rapidly move the agreed promise of DPI to action. What geopolitical outcomes can the rapid deployment of DPI deliver? So, Alison. Mansi, over to you.
Thank you ORF and Thabo Mbeki Foundation for organizing this absolutely interesting session and for putting together a stellar panel. I hope the Indian G20 presidency did a good job of, I hope everyone in the crowd knows what DPI is. Is there anyone who doesn't know what DPI stands for? Everyone knows? Oh. Okay, so you'll learn more. Just to give you a very brief context, DPI stands for Digital Public Infrastructure, and it's an approach to digitalization that we will talk a lot more about. So I don't want to take away from the speakers and the insights that they have, but it's also something that's become a G20 priority and also an approach that many countries want to work towards. So, and if there are any questions, we'll definitely have them answered. So I'm going to start very quickly because we have only 45 minutes, so I don't want to waste a single minute. Anag, let me start with you. So Anag comes with he comes with a mixed background. He's worked with the government, he's worked with the private sector, and now he's an investor. So Anag, if I start with you, if you want to just give a very quick background on how you understand DPI and what is a good way to understand DPI, how is it different from digital platforms or how we understood e-government, and if and is it the same for every country?
Thank you, Mansi, and thank you to the organizing team for having me here. The demystifying DPI, there are various definitions to it. One can put it very simply that these are networks or other foundational technologies to provide citizens the services, the public services that they are entitled for at a scalable, interoperable, and an inclusive way, in a much more fast-tracked and a speedy manner. The idea behind DPI is not new. To be very honest, I consider the internet and the GPS also to be DPIs. Just the format, or rather the shape of it is changing in terms of how emerging tech is, developing over the years, rather frog leaping its various avatars in many ways. So DPI typically is a foundational technology on which multiple other platforms are actually built to ensure that there's a certain public service that the citizens can be entitled to in a way that there's very less leakage, and obviously there are various principles of design that go into making it. As far as your second question is concerned, the approach to DPI varies from country to country, but the principles applied in formulating the infrastructure to DPI are probably the same, whether it's in terms of inclusivity, whether it's in terms of governance, whether it's in terms of private sector participation, to ensure that the end state ultimately remains the same. The mechanisms to it may be different, and they are different for various countries. In India, we have the India Stack, which is a set of technologies, or rather a set of platforms that ensure that the last mile, the last man standing is actually entitled to get the services that the government is willing to provide. Similarly, you have Estonia doing great work in cybersecurity and also digital identity. Similarly, the Smart Nations Initiative in Singapore, and so on and so forth. So as I said, the end state is ultimately the same. It's just that the mechanisms and outputs of various countries depend on multiple factors that can influence it.
Can you talk a little bit about those multiple factors that?
Yeah, so ultimately it depends. The way we have, the way the infrastructure is laid is pretty much the same. The technology remains the same. It's just that the approach towards it in terms of what is the governance behind it? What should the end state look like in terms of whether it's digital payments, whether it's digital IDs, what is the immediate priority as far as maybe the political color is concerned, the social context of that particular society. So, I mean, this is something like, typically a foundational technology having different shapes and sizes, depending on the scale at which you want to deploy it. I mean, given the context of India, the way the DPI infrastructure has enabled economic growth and economic inclusion is a stunning case study. I mean, whether it's by the UN or whether it's by famous business schools, DPI has revolutionized the way economic inclusion in India has been done. 1 billion plus users now with financial bank accounts. You have internet users which have crossed 1.1 billion as a population. So if you look at the scale, that kind of deployment of DPI by India has enabled it to leapfrog many years of development.
Thank you, Anag. Stephanie, I'll come to you because it follows on from what Anag just said about countries trying to have a different approach. And then on the other hand, you have some companies like Google and Xstep trying to put together something called DPI in a box, which is exporting the idea of DPIs and taking it to the rest of the world. So what do you, for the benefit of the audience, if you can talk a little bit about what DPI in a box you think, what it is and what you think it is, and whether or not that sort of approach works for exporting the idea of DPI.
Yes, thanks, and good, this is on. No, thank you for your question. So DPI in a box is interesting. So it was announced, I think, a few months ago, and it is an idea put forward by Google to get into the DPI space by essentially creating a toolkit through which we might be able to export India's experience around the different components of its DPI. It's built on Google's cloud technology, and it's sort of pitched as this, quote-unquote, plug-and-play approach to digital public infrastructure as a sort of way for countries that have not really been able to, say, develop some of these sort of foundational areas of DPI like digital ID, digital payments, thinking around data exchange, to sort of take what India has done and implement it quickly. So I want to just sort of think on this a little bit, because I think sort of this space of what India has done, what has worked, some of the challenges around it, and then how we think about exporting it or what other countries can take from India's experience is important, especially as we are talking about the infrastructure of the state. Digital ID is foundational to how the state recognizes citizens participate in public life, how citizens recognize one another. So I just want to dwell on sort of critiquing, basically, two sides of Google's DPI in a box. First, Google, and second, the box. So on one side, the idea that Google would provide the toolkit for digital public infrastructure raises some fundamental questions about what I saw as some of the early discussions about what DPI was. When I saw DPI, when it was initially sort of put forward and promoted to me around the beginning of India's G20 presidency, it was put forward as an alternative to US big tech and to China. This was a solution developed in India's approach. It came from the global south, for the global south, and for the global majority. Google providing this is a very different model. If we base it on Google's cloud technology, what happens to that sort of foundational alternative way of thinking about government-led digital transformation apart from big tech? It's founded on big tech. The data, the cloud technology is based in Google. And what's interesting about this is that it also points to some of the challenges that are embedded in DPI itself. So this is not the first time Google is involved in the wider infrastructure of digital public infrastructure. Google Pay and Phone Pay, I think, have around estimates of, correct me if I'm wrong, 85% of payment transactions in India around DPI go through Google and Phone Pay. So the idea that this big tech is part of the picture is there. But the fact that it's now being promoted as a way to export it really causes us to think, what are the power dynamics around digital public infrastructure? Where are the concentrations of wealth and profit across the stack and beyond the stack? And I think that role of Google is incredibly important as we think about exporting this model to countries like South Africa, across Africa, small island states, countries with a population of 1 million or less. So that's one side I think we really need to think about, that this draws attention to. The second side is thinking of the box. And here, there's 3 things I want to have us think about, and none of this is new. This is sort of a challenge as we think about development models for different countries where this exists before. One is, can a box account for the logic and enabling environment that is required for DPI to work as it's been intended? What's the underlying physical infrastructure? Is it there? How sustainable is it? Is the tech literacy there among citizens, among government? Is there rule of law? Is there political buy-in to implement this technology in a way that is meeting the needs of citizens within the country as well? And I think that is going to massively vary. And we've already seen it. If you think about Brazil's approach, Estonia's approach, India's, there's differences there. We use DPI to call, as you say, to call all of this DPI, but it's very different. And the physical infrastructure, the politics of a country matter a lot to what's actually going to be possible. A lot of these tech problems are not tech problems, they're political problems. I'm biased because I'm an academic in politics, but I think often the reason why things fail is not the technology itself, it's the political context around it. Second, and this gets a bit more into the nitty-gritty around what the box is achieving, because in a sense the box is designed to lower the startup costs for countries around implementation of these layers of digital technology. But if we're thinking about India versus, say, the Comoros, the cost-benefit calculation of upfront versus marginal costs are going to differ. And it's not that the box is without costs. Oftentimes they bring in private firms for the data centers, the financing, the expertise. So there's still costs that are coming to a country. It's then based on technology of a foreign firm, which then needs to be maintained. So thinking about cost-benefit calculus within each country is important, and I'm not sure the box captures that. And then the third one ties into that a little bit more, and that's just around the sustainability of funding around this. Where is the initial funding coming from? How are countries like South Africa going to continue to fund this infrastructure in the long term in a way that is secure as well, and thinks about the inevitable privacy, cybersecurity risks that come with any digital ID program, for example. And so I guess just finally, to summarize my point, sort of we think about what Google's DPI in a box brings attention to. It's one, the concentration of power and wealth. Where is it going to? What does that mean in countries like South Africa? Second, DPI is public rails for private innovation, but that's got to go back to public value as well. Where is that in the calculus? It's not going to be necessarily automatic for Google providing public value in the same way that's of interest in South Africa. And third, it needs to be politically informed and needs-driven. And I think, just to tie into maybe the wider discussion, is with DPI in a box, who is in the driver's seat? Is it South Africa? Is it Google? Is it India? And from the perspective of countries where this is being targeted, how do we ensure that their needs are in the driver's seat and not just being driven by the provision of an external model, the provision of external funding? And I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Stephanie. If I'm reading between the lines, you're saying DPI in a box is a bad idea. But Janab, coming to you, so can you talk to us about Open Gambia and whether, did exporting of any idea or support really help you? I think your microphone will be on. I think it's on, yeah. So can you talk to us a little bit about the Open Gambia network, how it got started, what sort of support you were seeking, what the challenges, and how it's going now and these success stories?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I would start by elaborating more on the experiences with Open Gambia Network, how we started, what were the challenges and the lesson learned, and some of the successful stories that we had. So Open Gambia started, it has a mother, because in college 2 years ago, Foundation for Digital Economy came to our school, was ready to teach students about DPI, because it's a whole new thing in Africa, in the global south. And in West Africa, where I come from, the Gambia, being part of the least developing African countries. So it is very important for students to be equipped with the knowledge, to know more about DPI in order to have forums like this to talk about the stories and some of the challenges we had. So the Foundation for Digital Economy came to the school, and then some of the students, and I was part of those students, who really was ready to know about DPI. I was like, okay, I have to go for this. I applied, and then we were shortlisted. So from there, we joined the group, and then for 6 months, it took us 6 months to really know about DPI, open protocols, how we can use it to solve real-life problems, because DPI is here to solve issues that are happening currently in our communities. So from there, step 2, I would take you through on how I become from a student to being the group leader when we started Open Gambia Network. So after 6 months, Open Gambia Network was registered under the government through the Ministry of Justice. It became a non-profitable organization. So we started with e-commerce, which was a bit critical because we were learning from the use cases that some of the countries like India has used DPI to implement it. Countries like Brazil, and here South Africa is holding the presidency, trying to have successful stories like other countries that hold the presidency. So we started with e-commerce, and it was a bit critical because we were like, how can we help their businesses so that they can be in the digital world, whereby everything would be easy for customers, everything would be easy for business holders, everything would be easy for people like me who are lazy to go to the market every day. So it was really a challenge for us to implement it. And at the end of the day, some of the challenges we had was funding, which Stephanie actually elaborated on. Funding, it's one of the challenges that the least African countries are facing. And the second challenge was having collaboration with the government. And 2 weeks ago, we had a memorandum of understanding signed by the Ministry of Digital Economy, which we have been following up for over 6 months. So that collaborative should be there, but it was a challenge with the forced project. But now we are, I can say we are in the phase of implementing DPI in a different project. We're looking at education and skilling project pilot, where we would teach young students about DPI, teach students about communication, marketing, things that they can do around their careers. So from there, we can help them find job opportunities around, because the case study we did before we start this project was most students would find it difficult from graduating or completing their certification courses and having access to opportunities and jobs. So these were the main challenges that we actually see that students were facing. So we're like, okay, let us have this infrastructure, let us build this network, and we have an amazing engineering team, which all of them are young people. And then they build a network with the help of Bacon open protocols. And we are ready to roll out to bring students on this network to enroll, do their courses. At the end of the day, they will be certified, and you would have a profile. That is the most amazing part of this project. You would have a profile and your digital certification, because we're talking about digitalization. We're talking about how we can digitize our physical infrastructures, and education is the primary key for us to focus on, because it's the grassroots level. So from there, you can have your profile and you can upload your digital certification, and anyone that is like in the public sector, in the private sector, can come to the network and see your digital certification and see that, okay, Genevieve is really doing well. She has done DPI, and I think if I bring her in my company, we can do something. We can transform into the digital era. So this is what we have done. Yes, thanks.
So you're saying that it didn't work for e-commerce, but it's working for the skilling and education.
Yes.
So that's also another, I think, important point, that it doesn't work in all, I mean, even within the same country, it may not work for all use cases.
Sure.
So shifting gears a little bit, and Alison, the country is taking over the G20 presidency. So would you want to reflect on the global discussions on DPI, the UN DPI safeguards framework, the digital compact, and how do you think this discussion, the global discussion on DPI, given that there are so many country contexts, what is this discussion going to look like and what should it focus on?
Thank you so much, and for these really interesting inputs. So, you know, I think the global context, the Troika leadership of the G20 under India, Brazil, and South Africa has created particular opportunities. I think the initiation of the Global Digital Compact by the Secretary General post-COVID, with the realization of the compounding effects of digital inequality on the structural inequalities that we have, that prevented large numbers, well, the majority of Africans certainly, from mitigating the negative impacts, the public health risks and the economic risks through digital substitution, mainly because, you know, the majority of Africans are not even online. Really kind of, created the timing and the moment for the Indian putting DPIs at the center of their G20 strategy, but also, of course, of a digital transformation strategy that's been able to gain momentum during that time. And I think what's interesting is when you look at the kind of initiation of that and the Global Digital Compact, there was, you know, the recognition that, I think in the Secretary General's words, that the two seismic impacts globally happening on a planetary scale that will affect inequality and this achievement of sustainable development goals was digitization, of course, climate change being the other. But I think if you look at the early sort of thinking about this, it was quite sort of kind of old-fashioned kind of digitalization kind of concepts and things, and I think it's matured a lot during the process, even into the final compact for the Pact of the Future, that although there were several clawbacks on many things, actually began to embed some of the concepts around, around DPI and mechanisms to practically address some of these problems. And of course, during this process, there have been a lot of parallel multilateral processes as well within various bodies, but very strongly driven by UNDP, and working together very closely with the Tech Envoy's office, building on the Global Digital Compact mandates to really take this forward. They've introduced the this UN DPI safeguards framework. And I think it does go a little bit further than some of the other work that was done. I think a challenge with a lot of these frameworks that are developed on a global scale is, you know, really getting them contextualized when they're applied locally. And I think if you look at the digital readiness assessments that, you know, go with that, you actually don't need the digital readiness assessment. You know, you're going through the motions because you know the infrastructure's not there. And in the case of DPI, the data exchange, the digital ID or bio ID, the financial payment systems aren't there. So you kind of just, you know, going through the kind of obvious. And what is often missing from these is the how. How are we actually going to do it under these circumstances? And I think the G20 framing, I think the Global Digital Compact has allowed us to say, you know, underpinning these, I mean, I think there's a lot of conflation around digital public goods and digital public infrastructures, and there's certainly components of digital public infrastructures that are digital public goods. But because of those digital public goods aspects, if these are global digital public goods, then as public goods are needed as critical inputs into economy and society, and global governance needs to take responsibility for the realization of that at the national level, at the regional level, etc., it's created a kind of an incumbency on governments that do have resources and formations to be established to address these problems globally. But I think, unless we do something quite different from what we've done before, we are simply going to be finding another mechanism that doesn't address some of the underlying problems. So I think the safeguards framework is good in that it goes a little bit deeper into what kind of safeguards you need in resource-constrained environments. But I think, like many others, and my critique generally of DPIs and use of AI as kind of panacea for social, sustainable development and these kinds of things, is that we're still not actually saying how do we address those really difficult structural problems that mean that this is just kind of dressing on top unless we do. So the harms framework are very important. They look at the risk of foundational and operational principles that you need to have in place so that you're not moving ahead on certain things and some of the basics aren't taken care of. There's like there's been with many other frameworks, a considerable guidance provided on building trust frameworks, which are absolutely critical and have been rather reductionist, I think, in other frameworks. They've focused really on safety, security, and on data protection, very narrowly on data protection. And so I think broadly, again, in terms of critiques and I think what has been offered by the G20 leadership, and particularly now in the T20 work, responding to the Digital Economy Working Group of the G20, is this need to embed social justice and economic justice components. So I think some of the fundamental rights frameworks are there in relation to AI, the kind of ethics frameworks and that, but there's not actually the frameworks that we need to get the transformational side of these. So, just to say, DPIs are not inherently transformational. They need very strong governance frameworks to ensure that there is access to these various infrastructures, that they are available. And that it's not just about the rectification of the uneven impacts of harms, which we know primarily in a global South context, the African majority world context, are issues of exclusion. So we don't even have the privilege of some of the other harms because you don't even have any data to be breached, digitalized data to be breached, and those kinds of things. So I think as acknowledging that there are these uneven impacts and that individualized notions, first generation rights, protections around privacy and maybe freedom of expression, although that often doesn't even come up in these contexts, is not sufficient to address some of these problems, that you actually need to look at collective and systemic negative impacts that happen here, particularly exclusion, and then of course that you are looking at the economic opportunities. So I think the safeguards framework is wonderful and it deepens that a bit, but I think we're still not getting that economic justice framework that you will require, that it's not only about redressing the uneven distribution of harms, but the uneven distribution, profoundly uneven distribution of opportunities. And that goes to the different opportunities, for example, in public-private interplays. So yes, DPIs are an extension of previous work that certainly in the African context will have to acknowledge the private provisioning of public goods. But historically, those have not been effectively regulated and not been delivered on. And so I think the creating of opportunities, we speak about DPIs in terms of mobilizing or assisting SMMEs participate in these sort of things. But you need very strong governance frameworks for DPIs not to primarily benefit those who are already online, those who already have resources, the companies that can produce DPI in a box, and those kinds of things. So I think it's great, but I still think in terms of the ongoing work of the G20, the focus on the economic opportunities needs to be far more focused and directed. Yeah.
That's a perfect segue into my second round, which is going to be very quick, and hope to make it very useful for the organizers in terms of focusing on what is that one thing. So Alison, you spoke about the gap between, at least there is a global governance, there's global thinking around the risks, but the mitigation of the risks in a localized context is still to be done. So I'm going to do a very quick round with everyone on what they think the South African presidency should be focusing on with regard to DPIs. And right after that, we'll open it up for questions. So let's start with Anna, very quickly on what you think the South African presidency should be focusing on.
Well, I mean, with DPI and its governance frameworks, DPI per se is the way it's a set of protocols, and the design principle is very important once you implement it, and that's the way that DPI is exported. I think one of the most important things that South Africa can do during its year of presidency in the G20 is actually the set of conversations around unleashing entrepreneurship and innovation with regards to DPI as a foundational technology, where you can build ecosystems around it. Especially our experience in India has been that we built a great startup ecosystem around DPIs, and the way that it has unleashed creativity, innovation, and also obviously with the economic constructs behind it and the positivity that goes with it. I think if cross-border dialogue can be initiated around these ecosystems, especially in the global south, related to DPI and the innovations around it, that would be something which would be a great takeaway from the presidency.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I'll try to. Thanks. I think just expanding a bit on what others have brought up as well, and I think Alison's, if I were to think of one thing that would be ideal, it would be using the G20 as a space for friction where we need friction in the DPI rollout. It is important, obviously, that we are seeing digital change compounding existing inequalities globally, but doesn't excuse moving so quickly that we miss out on the governance questions, the rule of law, rights that are necessary to, one, mitigate increasing these inequalities, and also missing out on some of the opportunities, increasing the harms that might be associated with it. So that's what I would say, is using the G20 as a space for friction where friction is needed, especially thinking from the perspective of South Africa and the African continent.
Thank you. Janova?
So my suggestion to the South African G20 presidency would be, like what Alison was talking about, promoting inclusive policy frameworks, whereby we can have advocate for establishment of inclusive and equitable policy frameworks that would actually help other developing countries, the other least developing West African developing countries, to have access and affordable digital services that they can offer to the community. Because we all know that starting from e-commerce, and it failed, I think since South Africa is holding the G20 and Africa is represented by the EU, which we all know that if some African countries had the opportunity to represent themselves, they would have the same opportunity that South Africa is having right now, developing in DPI, implementing it like other countries that had successful stories, India, Brazil. So I think South African can and actually, I would suggest that they actually have this framework that they can collaborate with least developing and African countries, especially initiatives like Open Gambia, trying to change the life of many young students and many Gambians as well. Thank you.
Alison, you have the last word.
Thank you so much. So, absolutely, I think these are actually all intertwined, and it's a really important that, and the President has said so, the President of South Africa has said so in Rio a week ago, that, the South African presidency will have this African lens, that it's only the second year that the African Union is an organizational member, and it's as the least digitally developed region and continent, it's absolutely critical that these issues, as I said, because they are global digital public goods, and we're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think the thing that South Africa needs to do is, as I said, take forward this integrated digital transformation agenda of the Troika leadership. It moves again from the emerging economies, Indonesia obviously before that, to the US in the next round. And so it's really important that this really strategic moment, probably once in 2 decades moment, that we take this opportunity to really redress some of these long-standing, historical injustices and inequalities. And I think that's what's really important about the South Africans' G20 presidency on DPIs, which it is very strongly on the Digital Economy Working Group agenda, is that the focus is really on, what we are going to do differently to ensure that these resource-constrained countries can actually benefit equitably from these things. And I think that's the important part. The South African G20 tag themes are around solidarity and equality and sustainable development. And those are obviously very pertinent to this African lens on that. From the T20 implementation roadmaps from Brazil, a number of G20 recommendations, roadmaps were done for them, implementation roadmaps, and one of them was on DPI, in which we took forward the unfinished business from the DPI, G20 in India's call for a governance framework for DPI that was further developed, and a lot of work was done in this with a proposal from the T&C 20 for a D20 that is going to go forward as an initiative, not as an engagement group, because it's obviously not. But that's how important this is seen. Data governance is the glue for DPI. If we don't get that right, like it is for AI, and a lot of these things that we are trying to use as I said, panaceas for very deep-seated problems. So I'm hoping, and I think the South African government and the Department of Communications and Technologies already, in discussions with industry, has spoken about ensuring that DPIs can meet these welfare, objectives, these social value outcomes of it, that we can put very clearly a public value framework together that ensures access. I mean, DPIs in South Africa are going to look very different from they do in the rest of the continent, and they're certainly going to look very different from they do in India with its big Aadhaar and digital ID programs that it could build everything around, and even the big PIX digital payment systems in Brazil. That were, by the way, the state was necessary to engineer those private companies to come together to form that national platform. So I think it is going to be about, public-private interplays. There's no way, I know a lot of the calls for DPIs has been in the context of, institutional and market failures around digital and telecom reform in many of our countries. But those are really issues of ineffective institutional capacity and endowments, the rule of law, the legitimacy, all of those bigger pictures besides the actual regulation of, affordable prices and those sorts of things. And also, but more importantly, we know that these, underpinning digital inequality is actually, education and human development. And so unless those issues are kind of addressed systematically, which DPI can do, but the underpinnings have to be there first before it can be used to address many of those problems. So I think, I think South Africa's, as I said, it's a consolidation of DPIs for equitable inclusion and for redressing uneven harms that we're seeing in this environment. But as I said, I think together with strategies on micro-enterprises and innovation, but also digitization of the informal sector, which isn't happening in South Africa, so you can't even use DPIs for social relief under pandemic situations and those sorts of things. So I think there's a very practical way in the way South Africa can take this forward in creating governance frameworks that can work in Africa, that deal with the neo-colonial legacies we have around our economies and our institutions. And because South Africa has a very strong democratic, constitutional, human rights framework, to understand how that can be leveraged to meet the needs of all.
Sure, I'll quickly summarize. I think we have 5 key takeaways for the organizers. One is like more on the implementation side, have a public value framework that also brings in the private sector interplay, the data governance framework that you spoke about, more on the African lens, more voices from least developed countries that are struggling with resources, slowing down, I guess, and then unleashing entrepreneurship and innovation, which is a big part of the DPI design itself. So we've had a productive discussion, but opening it up for the audience, please, the mics on either side, introduce yourselves briefly and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. It's very interesting, Stephanie, what you said about Google's role. When DPI was in its formative years, or months, there was a lot of scorn and skepticism from the big tech companies in US and mostly US actually. I've had some private conversations where they said, it doesn't work and where's the profit in it for us? But now you see them jumping into it. My question to you and Anag as well is, what kind of balance do you see between the role of the government and big tech in creating DPI which safeguards the interests of consumers and citizens?
We can't hear you. Is the mic working?
Good morning. Okay. My name is Prince Oyakure. If I may understand you clearly, digital economy promotes accountability, transparency, and participation in the public sector. We're also improving efficiency and effectiveness of government services. But my question really is, I want you to shed more light on the components and challenges of DPI. The components and challenges of DPI. Thank you.
Thank you. We can take, sure.
Yeah. Deepak Mishra, ICRIER, New Delhi. Wonderful session. As some of you mentioned about the fact that DPI was an idea which has existed for a long time. Internet is the biggest DPI that we have. But the fact that this particular generation of DPIs that's being marketed today was crafted or made in India or made in Global South, relevant for the problems for the Global South, does make a lot of sense, and that's why you do want to see these ideas being propagated throughout the world. I get Stephanie's point that letting Google be the exporter of this idea may come with lots of concerns. But I would really like to hear from Alison and from Jinawe in terms of, from Africa's point of view, who would they trust? A big tech like Google's exporting this, or a national government like Government of India with its own expertise and pros and cons of that, or it's the local homegrown solution. So I mean, we can all say what is ideal, but it's for the beneficiaries to think about what makes sense from their point of view, given the capacity and other constraints you face. So I'd really like to hear, whom do you like to be the champion of this in your countries? Thank you.
Very interesting questions. Let's start with Alison, I think, and then I think everyone can respond one by one. Just so, Alison, do you want to use the mic?
I suppose just picking together some of the questions together, I think what is important when we speak, somebody was asking about the components of DPI and the challenges, and I think again in terms of those digital readiness assessments or DPI readiness assessments, a lot of the focus is on the infrastructure And as I said, we do need, we need the foundational broadband infrastructure. We do, which we don't have across Africa adequately. But more importantly than that is we've got a lot of bandwidth everywhere. We don't actually have the abilities, people don't have the capabilities and competencies to be able to use those. So you've got broadband out there, people can't use it. So it really is a transversal thing. It's not a, it's not an infrastructure thing. It's not going to be only addressed by looking at those infrastructures, but we do need to get those digital infrastructures, data infrastructures, bio-ID, financial payments. These systems have to be there. And I think the thing is, I think the points were made. A lot of these things we've been working on, national broadband networks, we've been working on bio-ID. The point is that this comes together in an ecosystem that is effectively governed through an enabling state. And I think to go to the question of trust, often in earlier documents, multilateral and development bank documents, issues of trust have been checkboxed around security and data protection, so privacy rights. And it's so much more complex than that. So we have actually a very nice data policy framework for Africa that actually really speaks about this enabling environment that you need, an enabling state that you need in order to effectively regulate and manage the private sector that has to deliver on these things, because we don't actually have a lot of that capacity. So that legitimacy is an issue because there are lots of states in Africa. And sorry, one point that I want to make on this is that they're all, very, very many different states, but that we can develop, and through these data frameworks and things that we've signed up to, we can develop, common standards that will allow us to create DPIs that are interoperable, that we've got, markets that have economies and scale that you need for effective data economy and innovation and those kinds of things. And these are going to be absolutely critical to have in place if we're going to see more equitable benefits from the African digital single market and the African continental free trade area. So DPIs are really have the potential, if they are treated like as an ecosystem, to unlock some of this value.
We'll have to really hurry up. I just saw the time's up come. But Alison, you're saying that it's going to be the state, but an enabling state with empowered institutions. Janaba, very quickly, if you can respond to the questions.
Yes, so I would answer the last question. I think the guy that was asking about the challenges and the component. And I've made mention of the realities that are happening on ground. The first challenge is funding, and then the second challenge is collaboration, having collaboration with the government. And then the second question was about who do we trust? And I think we are a startup, and then we are working on implementing DPI. So I think if the government doesn't trust startups like this to implement DPI, so I think government has a bigger role to play in this, to trust small initiatives that are trying to implement DPI in their countries. Yes, thank you.
Role of government is undeniable. Anagan,
Yeah, so I mean, there was
question.
a question on big tech versus the government in this, and the debate continues. Okay, I don't really have an answer to that, but one of the structures that have worked well is a not-for-profit labeled as critical infrastructure with great oversight. I think that's something that's how in India, typically with the NPCI, the ONDC, and so on and so forth, those structures have worked well. And that's, I think, there's a lot of debate and discussions that's required to improve the ecosystem, or rather, even the system of governance there. But that's the initial part. But as far as one thing which is very critical to DPI is that we should avoid a single vendor system, or rather a single vendor situation, because the dependency and the capability then are not going to be proliferated to the masses, and possibly that will stem the kind of ecosystem that we want to unleash the innovation and creativity and the entrepreneurship in the ecosystem. So the single vendor situation should be completely avoided.
Stephanie.
I'll be super quick. Just on the first question about government versus big tech. I think as we get into increasingly complex AI, reliance on computing capacity, it's hard to not see a role for big tech anywhere, and won't get into that if you think about it from a supply chain perspective. But what I think needs to be at the heart of this is, one, what are the dependencies that we're creating within the state? And do those dependencies enable the state to still be accountable primarily to citizens and to all citizens' well-being? And if the role of big tech compromises that, that's when I start to get worried.
Wow. I think that's a great point to end this discussion on. Can you all join me in thanking the panelists for this?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mansi, Alison, Jaineba, Anhag, and Stephanie, if I could invite you to the top of the stage for a quick photograph. We'll move swiftly to the next session, De-Stressed Economies, a resilient infrastructure for climate-smart growth.